Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Suniti Symposium. Today, we gather to honor and celebrate the life, legacy, and profound contributions of Dr. Suniti Solomon, a trailblazer in the field of HIV research and treatment. Dr. Suniti Solomon's pioneering work, compassion, and dedication have left an enduring impact on the medical community. Today's symposium is an opportunity to reflect on her groundbreaking contributions to research in infectious diseases and to inspire continued progress in this vital field. Our goal today is to foster dialogue, share knowledge, and encourage collaborations among professionals. Through a series of enlightening presentations, panel discussion, and interactive session, we encourage you to actively participate, ask questions, and share your insights. We begin our program today with the inaugural ceremony with the lighting of the traditional lamp and the Tamar Thai Vartha. I request you to please stand for the Tamar Thai Vartha. I'd like to invite Dr. Amita Gupta, Professor of Medicine and Director, Division of Infectious Diseases, Faculty Co-Chair, John Hopkins Gupta Klinsky India Institute, John Hopkins University School of Medicine, on the stage for the lighting of the lamp. Dr. Gregory Lucas, Professor of Medicine, John Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Shruti Mehta, Professor of Epidemiology, Chair, Department of the Epidemiology, John Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Paul Outer, Professor of Medicine and Clinical Director, Division of Infectious Diseases, John Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Mark Sakowski, Professor of Medicine and Senior Associate, Dean for Clinical Trials, John Hopkins University School of Medicine, to light the lamp. A few of our staff to drape the traditional ponade. Dr. Chitra, if I might invite you on stage. Please wait, sir. Please wait. Dr. Pradeep. Sorry. Mr. Shri Krishnan. Kartar Singh, sir. Vidya, please come on stage. And Sunil, if I could just have you for a minute. We have one more small. If I could request you to please come on stage for the phone. You can start from that side. Thank you, ma'am. If I can also invite Dr. Gavin and Dr. Nicole on stage, and Dr. Sunil and Dr. Subhash to please. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Sunil Solomon, Managing Trustee, YRGCARE Medical Educational Research Foundation, to give the welcome address.
Good evening, everyone. It truly is a pleasure to have everyone in this room today and online. I think there are many people joining us online because not everyone could be here in person today. So I think many of you know that we established YRGCARE in 1993, and somebody broke glasses outside. But so today really is like one of those days which is, it's happy, but it's also sad at the same time, because this is something that my mom and I have been talking about for many years, establishing one of these clinics, state-of-the-art research facilities. But unfortunately, she's not around to see it. And we will definitely play a short video for all of you who were not able to visit the facility in the morning, so you could actually see what the facility looks like and where we've gone with the foundation itself. But I want to start a little bit with my journey itself and how we got here and why we're doing what we're doing. And if I can get my slides, I think I wanted to start by acknowledging what my father did. So for those of you who know, my father was Dr. Solomon Victor. He actually established open heart surgery in Chennai. And when I was in medical college in high school, I really wanted to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. And so when I went and spoke to my father and I said, I want to be a cardiothoracic surgeon, what do you advise me to do? He said, well, cardiothoracic surgery is just way too downstream, because most people, by the time they need surgery, don't have money who can afford it. So most of them end up taking a loan, or they sell jewelry, or they sell whatever they have and borrow a loan, and that essentially keeps them alive for maybe a year or two. And whatever loans and debts they have get transferred on to their children and everyone else beyond that. So he essentially told me that if you really want to make an impact in people's lives and make an impact on health globally, then focus on prevention. Because prevention really is like the first step. And if you can prevent a disease, then you don't have to worry about multiple steps along the way. So this was back in 2002 when I was just finishing medicine. And at that point in time, for those of you who remember, India was probably the #1 in the world with the most number of HIV infections. We were at 5.7 million people. And my mom happened to be doing HIV at that point in time. And so it was a pretty crazy household to grow up in, because you had a dad who was an open heart surgeon, and he used to do a lot of dissection. So he would come home with like hearts of animals, and they would be stuck in my refrigerator. My grandmother didn't have the best vision, and she would cook dinner for us. And my mom would get very nervous about what we were eating, so it was a lot of fun. And then when we're having dinner, my mom would just casually bring up this conversation. She said, oh yeah, and my mom again was, at that point in time, was like 53, and she was like an older Indian auntie going into schools trying to educate people. And she would come across all these terms and she had no idea what these terms meant. Or maybe she did and she was testing me. So I still remember we were sitting on the dining table one night and she said, what is a blowjob? And so when you get asked that by your mom with your dad on the table, you're in this position where like, do I tell her what it is or do I not? Because if you tell her, then she's like, why do you know what it is? But if you don't tell her, then she's like, oh, I need to educate him. So it's like one of those weird positions, and that's sort of the household that I grew up in. But essentially what happened was that because she was working in the government, it got very challenging. And so she essentially took a voluntary retirement in 1993 to found YRGCARE. So when we started in a tiny apartment in Tinagar. It was barely 1,000 square feet when we actually started this building. It was on the first floor. Our first lab was like a kitchen sink, and that's pretty much where we started doing research. And at that point in time, we had like nothing. So essentially people would come in, they would get sick, and we would watch them die. And that's pretty much what HIV was like in the late 90s and early 2000s in India, before we got generic antiretroviral therapy. And so my mom, what she also did was, she established one of the first private voluntary counseling and testing centers in India at that point in time. And when you would go for these counseling sessions, a lot of people will come up. For those of you who've done this probably know, is like when you talk to students and you finish a class, many of them come up to me and say, well, one of my friends has this risk. And so where can my friend go for testing, right? Because it's never them. And at that point in time, there was no testing centers, there was nowhere else to go. So then they started a clinic on site, and where patients used to come, see people. All this was happening from a first floor apartment in Tinagar on Raman Street. And then what happened was people were getting sick. And so we couldn't figure out what to do with people when they were sick because we didn't have an inpatient service. There was a group from Australia that had a little hut behind the office, and that was where we would keep patients and watch them die, because literally that's all we had in the late 90s. Sometime around 2000, we established some collaborations with Hopkins and people at Brown University, and when patients would die there, they would ship us their medications. And so we were essentially running like a Dallas Buyers Club. So people would come, we would give them like 1 week's worth of medicines, doing whatever we could to just extend their life by 1 day. And that's pretty much where we started. And when I finished my MPH and I came back to India, I realized that what we were doing again was like too downstream, waiting for people to come in. So I wanted to actually go out into the field, find men who have sex with men, find the trans community, and figure out how do we actually find these people before they get sick, before they move to like advanced diseases, and how do we actually make a difference. And so that really was like our beginning of our expansion outside of India. And today we are in about 25 states across India. We have about 800 service delivery points. We have over almost close to 2,000 employees. And we've served about, like, I would say closer to like 500,000 people, whether it's like people living with HIV or children living with HIV, the trans community, men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs. So really responding to the needs of the communities. But I think something I always learned from my mother is never forget where you came from, don't forget your roots. And for us, our roots were always Chennai. It was always establishing a center of excellence, advancing science, advancing clinical care. And so that really is the impetus for the Suniti Solomon Center that we established in Chennai. So this center really brings together research, clinical care, and education all under one roof. For those of you who are also following the news, last week there was a new drug that was approved for HIV, which has 100% efficacy in preventing HIV infection, which basically is like as good as it can get. We barely have vaccines that are 100% efficacious, but we actually have medicine. But unfortunately, these trials didn't happen in India. They are happening everywhere else across the world. And in my opinion, I think we have some of the smartest scientists in the world in India, and what's lacking is the infrastructure. And so I'm hoping that through this building, we could actually build capacity of scientists both in India and globally to build something and be leaders in the field. Because I really think India can teach the rest of the world versus like borrowing from the world and trying to replicate in India. And we've been able to do this with some of our models, and especially with people who inject drugs and these integrated care models. We've been able to expand them from India to other parts of the world. And so the question is, like, does it only have to be service delivery, or can we also go into discovery? Could we be the first to identify vaccines for infectious diseases? And as you know, like, the world is constantly evolving. We have since had the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're currently looking at H5N1. We had a monkeypox, Mpox epidemic as well. And the question really is, like, are we ready for this? And all the other threats that come. And that sort of is the reason we have this facility established in Chennai, because it's built in a way that whatever the threat is, we are prepared to identify this threat, figure out what are the immunological markers, the virological markers, and therapeutic indications, and what drugs will work. So really preparing ourselves for the next generation and providing our next generation of researchers with the infrastructure that you need to make a huge difference. But I just want to end that really is a big picture, but what do we do currently? And so I think I want to always end with this story that my mom always told me, and something that she truly believed in. It's the story of the old man who was walking down a beach, and he saw this little child picking up a starfish and throwing it back into the ocean. And he went up to the boy and he said, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Oh no, the tide has receded and all these starfish are stuck on the beach. If I don't throw them back into the ocean, they're all going to die." And then the old man looked at him and he said, "But there are thousands of starfish across the ocean. How are you going to save them all?" And so the child picked up one starfish, threw the fish back into the ocean, and said, "Well, it made a difference to this life." So that really is what we're trying to do at YRG. We recognize that we can't save every person everywhere in the world, but I think everybody who walks into our clinics, we want to make a difference in their lives and make sure they leave with a smile on their face. And that really is our ethos. So we've been able to establish like free antiretroviral therapy for any child who's availing care at the facility. We want to expand it to widows, and then we want to expand it to like women, and essentially make the whole facility free, where people can come and avail of services without any money at all. But to do that, we need a lot of supporters and a lot of goodwill, and I think we wouldn't be where we are today without the support of all our donors, like Abbott Laboratories, Johns Hopkins University, Brown University, multiple donors, Gilead Sciences, and I just can't name everyone. And these are some of the donors whom we have who've been supporting us all along the ways, plus the communities, because people really are in the center of our mission and really control our response to the epidemic. And that's really what keeps us going and keeps our organization growing, is looking at people, seeing what their challenges are, and responding to those challenges. And the most important thing in our organization really is our employees. Like, we have close to 1,500 or 2,000 people across India, and I think they really are the driving force of the organization, and many of them have been with us since 1993. And so I must end by thanking all the employees for all their help and really making YRG what it is today. And I'm looking forward to continuing the growth of YRG to transform it to be a world-class facility where we find solutions not just for infectious diseases, but even for chronic diseases that may emerge. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm hoping you enjoy the rest of the session and the panel, and I invite you all to definitely make the panel a lot more interactive. Thank you.
I now invite Dr. Gregory M. Lucas, Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, to share his reflections.
Good evening. It's truly a great pleasure for me to be able to reflect on my 15-plus year history with YRG in the celebration of the new Suniti Solomon Center. I met Sunil in 2006 when he was a PhD student at Hopkins, and I was junior faculty. I don't know how old Sunil was at the time, but he could have passed for 14. Shruti Mehta and Sunil had established a cohort of people who inject drugs in Chennai, which revealed both a high HIV prevalence and extremely high mortality in people who were infected. Sunil was keen to develop interventions to improve on these poor outcomes. And on a shoestring budget, we embarked on a small pilot study that showed that treatment incentives could improve engagement in care and initiation of antiretroviral therapy for people who inject drugs. I visited Chennai for the first time in 2008 or so, and three impressions stand out. First, I knew that I was going to be meeting a lot of people, so I decided to keep a list of all the people that I was meeting. And I actually still use that list to this day. The first name on the list is Annie, Suniti's longtime administrative assistant, who sadly has died in the past year. Annie had a welcoming smile and demeanor that immediately made me feel at home. And as Sunil mentioned this morning, Annie was one of the major champions in making sure that the new center continued to have hospital beds for people who needed them. Second, there was a large bird cage in the atrium near the offices that was continuously chirping with activity. The birds seemed to me like a message of hope in the often tragic battle with HIV/AIDS. And I hope that an aviary will find its way into the new center. My third impression, of course, was of Suniti Solomon herself. A transformational figure, Suniti has received so many accolades from the global HIV community that it's really hard to know what more can be added. Personally, I can say that behind her great works, she was an immensely warm person who treated everyone as if they were important, even if they weren't actually very important. She invited me to a Diwali rooftop dinner at her house. She took me out to get proper South Indian coffee. She bought Indian dresses for my daughter. And at my first visit in Chennai, she sat me down one-on-one and presented the history of HIV and of YRG in India. It was this talk that would ultimately become the outline for her phenomenal Ngali Man plenary session delivered at CROI 2010. In 2012, Sunil, Shruti, David Celentano, and I collaborated with YRG to launch a study that aimed to characterize the epidemiology of HIV in the care continuum among people who inject drugs and men who have sex with men across multiple cities in India. We used a survey method called respondent-driven sampling, or RDS. In RDS, you start with a handful of volunteers and you ask them to recruit 2 or 3 people from their networks using coupons. Ideally, these people will return to the study site, complete a survey, have an HIV rapid test, and then go out and recruit 2 or 3 more participants. Over the course of approximately 5 years, we recruited nearly 49,000 people who inject drugs and men who have sex with men across 26 cities in India. At the time, both injection drug use and sex between men were illegal in India. And the question is, why did so many vulnerable individuals join this study? The answer, of course, is trust. The trust that YRG had earned over many years of unwavering advocacy for key populations. Before any large studies were envisioned, YRG conducted ethnography, focus groups, and stakeholder meetings to understand the context and the needs of the populations. This work often gets lost in abstracts, presentations, and manuscripts, but it is essential for research to work. I now think back to the many people at YRG that have supported me, made me laugh, and enriched my life in various ways. Krish and Ganesh, the enforcer and the money guy. These two brothers have been with YRG since the earliest days, and I've come to understand that the Earth would fall out of its orbit without them. Before I conclude, I just want to say a few words about Sunil. If you know Sunil at all, you'll know the optimism with which he approaches life. An optimism that, in my opinion, at times borders on the delusional. With Suniti's untimely death, Sunil was thrust into leadership of YRG. And in the years that have passed since, he has succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. He's expanded YRG from a provincial Tamil Nadu-focused NGO to a national powerhouse with activity in a majority of Indian states. No longer the skinny grad student, Sunil is now a professor of medicine at Hopkins. He has earned the two most prestigious grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The Avenir Award, which is given to junior faculty, and as of a few months ago, the Avant-Garde Award, an award for senior faculty. Sunil won a $50 million grant from USAID to implement innovative approaches to HIV testing, prevention, and treatment. And finally, he's a rapidly rising star and leader in the HIV Prevention Trials Network. So Sunil, with the vision that you share with your mom and your dad, congratulations on the leadership of this remarkable YRG team. Today we join to celebrate a vibrant new building, a building that is a testament to the vision that grew YRG from a small venture in a single office to a major force for HIV education and prevention across India. But of course, no building makes an organization successful. It's the people that do that. And YRG is more than a successful organization. It's a family. Cheers.
It is with great pleasure that we share with you a short video on the Suniti Solomon Center dedicated earlier today.
So Dr. Suniti, she used to always tell us 3 points. The one is she will always say, even if you provide care to one person, that person will always remember you. So remember, it's not a number game.
Dr. Suniti, she was able to identify for the very first time in the country the HIV/AIDS virus. So she didn't stop with just this discovery and decided that she had to devote the rest of her life to coming up with solutions for prevention, care and treatment of this disease. And that was, I think, the early years of the startup of YRGCARE.
Always I have believed that the role of a doctor is just not treating the disease for which they come. It goes beyond that. The thing of understanding the patient, understanding the background from which they come, and catering to the needs of the patient in a special way. Over the times, we have had better care, better medication, everything has improved.
And I think there's been no looking back.
One of the beautiful experiences of the patients when they come here is that the counselor sees them, and they make them feel very comfortable. They become like a family. So this is how our presence has been felt in the communities.
இப்போ இந்த நியூ ஃபெசிலிட்டியில பாத்தீங்கன்னா எல்லா சர்வீஸுமே ஒரே இடத்துல இருக்கு. லைக் அவங்க டென்டல் பார்த்துக்கலாம், கண்ணுக்கு உண்டான சிகிச்சை பார்த்துக்கலாம், ஐபி கேர் இருக்கு, டே கேர் இருக்கு, பிளட் சாம்பிள் கலெக்ஷன் பக்கத்துலயே இருக்கு, ஃபார்மசி இருக்கு. ஸோ எல்லாமே அவங்க ஈஸியா வந்து அக்சஸ் பண்ணிக்க முடியும்.
So at YRGCARE, treatment is free for all the children up to the age of 18.
YRGCAREல வந்து நிறைய டிஃப்ரெண்ட் டைப்ஸ் ஆஃப் ரிசர்ச் பண்றோம். அதுல ஒன்னு வந்துட்டு கிளினிக்கல் ரிசர்ச் பண்றோம், இன்னொன்னு வந்துட்டு லெபார்டரி ரிசர்ச் பண்றோம், தேர்ட் ஒன் இஸ் கம்யூனிட்டி ரிசர்ச்.
Initially, the laboratory was established along with the clinic to provide diagnosis of HIV. However, the laboratory had expanded its services and provide broad range of diagnostic tests.
We follow international quality standards at our laboratories, and we use daily internal quality controls at all our labs. Additionally, at our lab, we have biorepository freezers to store the specimens for future research.
The laboratory has shown significant role in research by collaborating with the national and international organization, by working on numerous studies related to HIV/AIDS, co-infections, drug resistance, tuberculosis, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and other sexually transmitted infection.
And we are one of the first ones in India to start up with this good clinical laboratory practices.
Just looking at what it has achieved and the potential it has for influencing the path of medical research in infectious diseases is tremendous. So it was for the very first time that this concept came up of an integrated care system that would bring all the different facets of prevention care, research, and the services that go with this kind of a work. And I think this is what differentiates YRG from other medical research institutions.
This is a very, very fulfilling role for all of us, including the entire team that is working behind, as well as the doctors.
This integrated center would provide the ideal ingredients for us to venture out into this new world of uncertainty in terms of infectious diseases. I expect that we will play a very important role in not just locally but nationally and internationally.
We have the capacity in India, we have some of the brightest minds globally, and be the people who actually discover these, whether it's vaccines or antibodies, and take that to the rest of the world. And that's what I'm hoping we can actually do from this facility.
It is with immense pleasure I now request Dr. Amita Gupta to highlight the John Hopkins Gupta Klinsky India Institute's commitment to India.
It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here in Chennai amidst all of you, dignitaries, guests, the YRG family, my friends and colleagues from Johns Hopkins, from Johns Hopkins India, from the Accelerate team, from NERT, from so many other walks of our partnership. And let me tell you what a day it's been. When I saw the incredible facility this morning, it took my breath away. It's been a dream that I have heard about for some time. But when you see it in reality, you sort of really feel so proud to even be affiliated and associated with such an esteemed, incredible organization that has truly changed more than 500,000 people's lives that we learned today. To take sort of action, to take the care, to be deeply committed about people who have had no voice, and to give them voice, to sort of give them dignity, to give them power, to educate, to train, and then be able to really make a difference in HIV, both the prevention and care. When it comes to hepatitis, when it think about LGBTQ communities, when we think about persons injecting drugs, and trans community, and so many others. It's an incredible, incredible organization, and I'm so proud of all of the work that's done each and every day. And no doubt this new facility in honor of Dr. Suniti Solomon, who has been truly one of our incredible heroes of India, who's really paved the way with her compassion, with her commitment, and with her really beautiful personality that she shared with so many of us and inspired us to be the best that we could be in the work that we do. So I just wanted to say a few words about our commitment and our love and our relationship with India, which now really spans almost a century. So India and Johns Hopkins goes back to the 1930s when we first started collaborating together in the field of public health to help establish one of the first public health schools in India, the All India School of Public Health. And since then, it's been an incredible journey as well. We've partnered with Indian Council of Medical Research, the Department of Biotechnology, with the IITs, with numerous medical institutions, and of course YRG, among many others, to really partner together to kind of solve big issues. And it's a partnership. There's been bilateral exchange and training. I myself feel like I grew up here by learning from my friends and colleagues here in India, really understanding some of the frugal innovation opportunities that occur here and making things possible with very little. Something that we really would benefit, honestly, in the United States, where we spend a lot of resource and not necessarily always improving the quality of care, despite having some of the most state-of-the-art resources. So it's very inspiring to have these partnerships to kind of think of how we can do things better. We have also created a series of faculty seed grants where we believe in sort of where the Indian institution puts in half the money and the Gupta Klinsky India Institute puts half the money. And we've done now a series of 6 of these grant cycles to do things like digital health, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, climate change, and the like. And I'm hoping to see many of you in this audience will be inspired to also apply for some of these grants and be able to sort of carry your dreams forth. We've also established student internships and training programs, both for students from the United States to come here to India, which I think is an incredibly important part of education because so much is possible here, and for Indian students to come to Johns Hopkins and also pursue some of their further training and interests, just like Sunil did way back in the day when he was 14. So I'll just say in closing, we're a small part of this incredible effort. We're here to help also build infrastructure, and so we help support a little bit of the laboratory that's been established in this new center. And I want to thank the foundational donors, Steve Klinsky, Maureen Sherry, Raj Gupta, and Kamla Gupta, who helped to really see the dream and want to support it. And of course, hope that many of our other donors will come to the table over the years to help bring new grants, new opportunities, and new ways to help improve the care and lives of our communities that we serve, whether it be in India, the United States, or around the globe, and we can find global solutions together. So thank you so much for having me be here at this incredibly wonderful event and this auspicious moment that really carries the legacy of Suniti Solomon in a way that she would be so proud of if she was here today. So please, let's give a moment to Suniti Solomon, our hero.
As we move to the next part of the program, just give us a few minutes as we set up, and I'll invite the panel shortly. introduce the panelists.
Hi everyone, good evening. So we'll move on to the sciencey part of it. I want to invite our panelists, Shruti Mehta, Paul Orwater, Mark Salkowski, and Gavin Clarity to please come up here. So I want to start by saying I never see the four of them together ever. We had to come all the way to India to actually see these four people in one room. Mark, Paul, and I work in the same division, but I don't think I've ever been in a room with the three of them, with the two of them together in the US. I don't think so. But anyway, so I just want to highlight a couple of key points. So Shruti is the chair of the Department of Epidemiology, and the Epidemiology Department at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health is the oldest, largest, the most prestigious epidemiology department anywhere in the world. And she does everything numbers. And I think with COVID, we had a lot of uncertainties about numbers. So she's going to talk to us about each of them is going to talk to us for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, from whoever, or I can ask them some questions. Paul Orwater is the clinical director for the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins. He was also the past president of the Infectious Disease Society of America. When we had COVID, he ran the guidelines for Hopkins. He was the person sorting through the press releases and deciding hydroxychloroquine, yes or no. And Mark Salkowski is our Senior Associate Dean for Research. He's also a professor of medicine. So he is known for hepatitis C globally. So every drug that we currently use to cure hepatitis C, he was in all the registrational trials. We won't have a cure for hepatitis C if not for the trials that he led. And during COVID, he was tasked with setting up research in a setting where you couldn't see people face to face. And last but not the least, we have Gavin Clarity, who is the head of infectious diseases at Abbott, and his team during the COVID pandemic were the first to identify the COVID antigen test. So I think all of you know the COVID antigen test, you put a test, his team built that test. But when I asked him what was the most, like earlier yesterday or maybe last week, what was the most you've accomplished, and he said getting an e-visa for India. That probably was like one of the biggest challenges in life. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Shruti, and if she wants to say a few words.
Thank you, Sunil. And I just want to, again, say how wonderful it is to have been a part of today. And just to say, that thinking about all that we've heard today about Suniti Solomon and her legacy, I think relating to that, to some of the things that we're going to speak about today, one of the things that Auntie always implored us to do was to do better, just to do everything better. And I think with COVID, I think we're going to reflect on some of the things that we did well and some of the things that we could do better and learn for the next pandemic. So I'm going to talk about data and surveillance. And when we talk about data and surveillance, I think it's important to think about it in a couple of different contexts. First, there's data and surveillance for pathogens that haven't yet emerged but might, right? How do you identify those bugs that are going to cause a pandemic? And then there's surveillance once a pandemic has emerged and what you do at that time to inform public health response. I'm going to focus more on the latter because that's sort of the space that I live in, but happy to talk about the first one if people have questions. The other thing, as an epidemiologist, when we think about what data we need, I always say, what's the question, right? So I think it's important to think about what the questions we were trying to answer at the time and what questions we would need to answer in a new pandemic. And I will say for those of us who were working through this pandemic, trying to answer questions, I think one of the challenges was the question changed every day. And by the time we got the data we needed or set up the study we needed to answer the question we were trying to answer, the question changed. And so I think we lived in that insane space. But there are some kind of inherent core questions to any pandemic. First are characteristics of the pathogen itself, right? How does it evolve over time? With COVID-19, I think this came to variants, right? How the different variants caused, how infectious they were, and the severity of disease that they caused. Then basic epidemiologic questions, incidence and prevalence. Seem like simple questions, but with COVID-19, we had, particularly with prevalence at the beginning, wildly varied estimates of the prevalence in a population at any given point in time. And some of this was related to assays, and Gavin will talk some about that, but a lot of it was related to how we were sampling those populations and where the data was coming from. Then it's about who's at risk. Who were the populations that were the most vulnerable to infection? Who were facing the most severe complications? What were the appropriate mitigation strategies, and what was the impact of those mitigation strategies? And again, that comes back to data. How do we know we need to have a good baseline if we want to know what we're doing is working. And then there's the long game, right? So I think a lot of times we focus, and rightfully so, we focus on the acute phase. I mean, people were sick and people were dying. So we were focused on the immediate questions, but I think many of us know, we've studied a number of viral infections, that it's not just about those acute symptoms. Often there are long chronic complications that may occur in a subset. And we're seeing that with long COVID. And the questions and the data systems that you set up at the beginning are critical not only for answering those early questions, but those longer ones. And then the other piece to keep in mind is, you all saw a lot of models during COVID. I think everyone became a modeler. Whether or not you had a degree in modeling, you became a modeler and you became an interpreter of those models. But the models are only as good as the data that goes into them, right? So all this that we're talking about, because the model can say, in some ways, whatever you want it to say. But I think when we're trying to forecast what's going to happen, should we close schools, should we keep schools open, that's all based on data systems. So because of, the speed with which we needed to answer questions, I think the first thing that you always do in these circumstances is you take the data that's readily available to you, right? What are the systems that are available? And that's the way you get your quickest answer, but oftentimes those data have the most biases, right? So it's thinking about those biases. And then on the flip side of that, there's the more robust, systematically collected data that don't have those same biases, but take sometimes years to collect. So how do you strike that balance? And a lot of what we did was trying to find the balance between those two. And so again, I think you start with what's routinely available. And for every country around the world, including India, this was case reports, right? So data that came from people that were getting tested and who was turning out positive. It was these data from around the world that informed the COVID-19 dashboard that most of you probably know, right, from Johns Hopkins, that we all, in the early days of the pandemic, went to figure out what was going on within our own state or country, right, those case counts. But we have to remember that those case counts come from a somewhat biased source, right? They're subject to who's getting tested. And that is about what testing is available. And we know that this was, again, wildly variable over time, by geography. Why were people getting tested? At some point, people were getting tested because they were sick, but at other times, people were getting tested because their jobs required them to get tested. Sometimes people were avoiding getting tested because if they were sick or they were known to be positive, they weren't able to work. So all of those things factor in to that data. And when you're trying to make estimates, particularly of disease incidence, how many new infections are we seeing, it's challenging when you go to those sources and you know all the underlying biases that underlie them. I think over time we moved away a little bit from case counts because there were so many changes, particularly as people were doing more rapid testing at home, and we moved to hospitalization data and deaths, which don't face some of those same biases, but again, there you're only measuring the most severe cases. So some challenges. The other piece that I'd say about those data is I think they're best when they're not just standalone and you're not just focused on how many tests positive, how many people are dying, but linked to real demographic and clinical data so that you can understand the nuances. So that's the kind of one side of the really easy to obtain data, the routinely available. The flip side of that is the more robust kind of gold standard epidemiology, bread and butter, which is that you set up a cohort study, and basically that's a cohort of people who are exposed. Some have been infected, some have not, and you follow people over time. And the huge advantage of that is that you don't have this bias of the people, coming for a specific reason, but rather your goal is to get a representation of the population. So a random sample or a population representative sample. And I think no one would disagree that this is the gold standard and this is what we wanted to do. I will say that I was part of a team that tried to do this in Baltimore. Incredibly challenging, expensive. The places that did this and did this well were like the UK, and I think Luxembourg was another place. They had infrastructure already in place that they built off of. And I think this speaks to one of the lessons to be learned is how do we set up that infrastructure so we have it going forward. I think this was a huge missed opportunity in many of our settings because we didn't, we do this for HIV. We've been talking about HIV all day. We have cross-sectional surveillance that happens. We have cohort studies that have been in place. We do this for HIV, yet in most settings, we weren't able to capitalize on that for COVID-19. And so I think that, again, we grappled with this because it takes a lot of effort, it's a lot of cost, but I think that if we had set up those studies in more settings, we would have had not only information to tell us things about, again, the acute phase of infectious, the acute phase of the infection, how long people were infectious, how people were clearing, and all of that, but also some of these longer-term questions related to long COVID. I think would have benefited from that study design. Somewhere in between those two, I think those are the extremes of what we do, are some of the innovations that I think happened within the pandemic, which was trying to rely on samples that we could get to easily and quickly. And I think Mark is going to talk about some of the challenges with research, but there was a lot of work related to social media, sampling people through social media, doing online surveys, saying, okay, what can we do to gather data quickly without contact, without having to see people face to face? And in those settings, it was also about recognizing that it was more than about just who was getting infected, but it was about behaviors. How were people testing? Why were people testing? How were people taking up non-pharmaceutical interventions, for example? What were people's attitudes towards vaccination? Who was getting vaccinated? Again, all of those data points matter to our understanding of how to mitigate the pandemic. The other innovation that I'll mention that I think came out because of with COVID-19 again existed, but I think was used more widespread was wastewater surveillance, right? This idea of kind of looking for virus and using that type of surveillance as an early indicator when we might expect to see increases in cases. So again, challenges, but there were innovations that came out of it. I think I'll just end by saying that, just a couple of themes that in my own head, I think about in terms of what we should do going forward. One, there's no one data source. It's all. I think everything that I've mentioned, the plan going forward has to be about a combination of these. And you have to consider the things that are easy to do, the things that are more difficult to do, but what the information you can get from the combination of all sources and integration where possible. And then second, I think, Second, I think that thinking about the long game, right? So I mentioned that already, but thinking beyond the acute phase so that what you set up today, maybe not the most critical question right at that moment, but thinking about what the questions might be down the road. So again, for long COVID. Third, and I think Mark is going to talk about this, our systems aren't set up for us to move quickly. We needed to move quickly. We will need to move quickly again, and we've got to figure out ways to break down the bureaucracy and all of that to be able to move more rapidly. Because I think each of us on this stage was probably frustrated at some point in time because we knew what we needed to do, but we couldn't move as quickly as we needed. Transparency and collaboration are critical. We've talked a lot about collaboration today and how important that is, but sharing case definitions, strategies across groups, across countries, again, to be able to compare data across different sources, having some common definitions and procedures helps with that. And then finally, we talked about this a lot across the day as well, this idea that it's not just one pathogen, right? So we think about COVID-19 or we think about the next pathogen on the horizon, thinking about where we can learn from previous things that we face and how we can integrate with what already exists. It's not about setting up a new system for one infection or one disease. It's about leveraging all of the sources that we have.
Thank you, Shruti. I'll now turn it over to Paul to tell us something about making clinical decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Sunil. And again, I'm quite honored to be here and helping share in this wonderful moment in celebration. Sunil asked me to speak about clinical protocols, and I thought I'd first start off with the concept of roving leadership. Just a brief story. I was an altar boy one Sunday at a very crowded church, and suddenly our pastor who was giving a sermon collapsed. And even in a crowded church, only 2 people rushed forward to help, to try to figure out what to do and take next steps. And I was just struck in my few days here in India learning about YRG that Dr. Suniti Solomon, yourself, the YRG team also exhibited this concept of roving leadership. You identified a problem, you didn't wait to have someone tell you what to do, you decided to take action, and you certainly have done that in spades. And I think as I reflect to March of 2020, when on March 13th a national emergency was declared in the United States, within a day, 5 of us decided to meet in a conference room in the afternoon to try to determine what we should do in our hospital system. At that time, I think a lot of people were struggling, would this be a big thing or not? And we decided not to wait. At the time, what did we do? There were 5 of us, and we looked, and there were 6 or 7 guidelines from China that had a whole range of interventions, from herbal remedies, lopinavir, ritonavir, as you know, in HIV medicine, oseltamivir for influenza. Others were advocating hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine in anti-malarial, for example. Others were advocating an antiparasitic, nitazoxanide. How do you choose when there is actually precious little evidence except some, what I might say, almost hearsay evidence from China on what's effective or not, and a lot of conflicting information? And I think as we sort of decide what do we have off the shelf to help our patients, I think some of the things we learned was we not only had those 5 people, but we decided to outreach quickly and got advice from virologists who are certainly in our Division of Infectious Diseases, anesthesiologists, pulmonologists, people that had experience in ARDS, adult respiratory distress syndrome, and emergency medicine. So we were able to solicit a lot of advice and have an engagement. And I think Shruti mentioned many of the facets that are also important in developing a clinical trial when there's lack of evidence. But I think what we learned early on was that we would get some things wrong. I think, the early embracement of hydroxychloroquine proved not to be the case. And I think there were some who had pretty good instincts that probably wasn't going to be biologically plausible. But for those of us that trained to follow the evidence in evidence-based medicine, we really didn't have that opportunity here. And I think one of the things that I took to heart is that as we developed guidance over time, we were reading preprints and trying to decide how to move this rapidly. We were making changes rapidly. Luckily, we were in an academic medical center where I think people weren't that upset about rapid change and recognized the rationale for it. But what also became very important is as we crafted advice and revised guidelines, we also had advice from the New York State AIDS guideline team based at Hopkins with Chris Hoffman, since they had rolled out guidelines on how to try to help do something rapidly and effectively communicate. And in the communication, the transparency is very important for engagement and trying to get effective treatments to patients, even when you have some uncertainty, but also the need to acknowledge then when things aren't right, what you might need to change as you move ahead. And I think we're still offering guidance 4 years later to the institution. It's not always followed, and I think some of the challenges are as something becomes more established, and there is an evidence basis, but there's still always nuances that require interpretation and guidance. And as the pandemic went on, even though we had this protocol, what was very important is that we had a weekly meeting to discuss latest science and the current guideline, but also we had daily calls at 7 in the morning with our clinicians who were working in the hospital, and we would try to use some of their experiences to gather information and try to decide what might be working and what wasn't. So in the end, I think when you have a protocol or you wish something to improve, quality improvement or a clinical trial, that's sort of straightforward in the sense you've identified a problem, there's an evidence basis. Here we had no evidence basis. And I think it was so important to have engagement with good communication, with lots of opportunities for that to happen, that really made a protocol a sort of living document, and also I think ultimately we're ahead of, at least initially on, what became some other guidance from professional societies or the National Institutes of Health. So, and as I reflect on some of the experiences and challenges here in India, I think obviously you're at the vanguard and identifying problems and trying to find solutions, and it sounds like you've really hit on a great recipe.
Thank you, Paul. I'll pass over to Mark.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here to join you for this important day and evening to honor Suniti Solomon and YRGCARE and all the great work that you all do. And I think, as some have suggested, there are many lessons of what has happened in India and through YRGCARE that can be applied to COVID and how we respond to that. Like Paul, I think back to March of 2020, and we did, in fact, move rapidly, but we did not move very efficiently in the U.S. People were running around, spending a lot of energy, trying to test many different things. And for a brief period of time, we forgot the basics of how we generate knowledge and evidence, how we learn something works. We do that through clinical research. And part of what we had to do in a time where people were driven by fear, anxiety, and concern about this rapidly emerging pandemic, where we didn't know where it was going to go, we didn't know if we would get sick caring for patients, we really had to take a step back and start to instill some of the principles of well-designed clinical trials. Part of what Paul was dealing with was a case report that was published of 10 patients who received a certain regimen, and pretty soon that was being used. We later learned that those were not great ways to treat patients, and when we did better trials with a sufficient number of people, we got the answers we needed about what worked and what didn't work. So the United States, where we like to do things a very slow and rigorous fashion, those of you who worked with the ACTG are familiar with the well-conducted clinical trials. We took time to apply those principles, and what we learned is we need to do that more quickly. We need to have a manner in which we can rapidly adopt a clinical trials framework and do it in a way that is funded with the right people and the right clinical trial sites very rapidly. And unfortunately, that was something that we did not have in place in 2020. I'd like to think we're better positioned today, if that were to happen again, to do appropriate. I think the second comment that I'll make, and it's something that we see here and how YRGCARE is set up, we need to marry clinical care with clinical research. The clinical care of patients is how we learn what questions to ask. In the intensive care unit, did patients do better when they were on their stomachs or on their backs? And how do we test that? And how do we design a trial to prove that we could potentially get more oxygen in the lungs of people if they were on their stomachs? Observations that perhaps corticosteroids worked better led to clinical trials that eventually answered those questions. And then the clinical trials going back to inform clinical care and back again. That intersection, linking clinical care to clinical research, is really essential. Suniti talked about collecting data and doing that in a way we're delivering clinical care, but also obtaining blood specimens, respiratory specimens that we can then save and learn more. Many of our discoveries came because we linked our clinical care to our clinical research machinery. I think another lesson to learn, and perhaps a third lesson, is to keep it simple. I talked a bit earlier about how we like to design very complex and scientifically rigorous trials, and there's absolutely a place for that. What we also saw was that situations, and the UK did this with their large studies, where they decided that perfection was perhaps not the goal and speed was more important. They designed large, pragmatic trials. They took their health system and they decided that they would test certain interventions. So rather than jumping on a 10-person experience with hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin, I can think back to some of the other things that people had tried, like ivermectin. They decided to test those in a rigorous way. They sacrificed some of the biospecimen collection. They sacrificed some of the rigor which we'd like to collect clinical outcomes. They relied on what happened in the electronic medical record. But what they did do is give us answers to questions. In fact, the first major intervention that we had was that corticosteroids actually worked for people who were sick enough to be in the intensive care unit. And that came from a pragmatic trial, not from some of the more rigorous scientifically based trials. So keep it simple is an important area. But there are also some things that we learned in COVID that I think were really important, and that's that we could leverage technology. We could leverage remote visits. And I was in Pune yesterday where the AMOCA trial was one of the first technologies to watch people take medications with TB that Bob Bollinger and Amita Gupta had launched many, many years ago. Well, we could leverage those video visits and things like that we hadn't thought of in clinical research, bringing that clinical research to where people are. So I think we did learn some important lessons about being a bit more nimble and not requiring people to come to us in their typical fashion. And then the final thing I want to really emphasize is we learned the importance of trust in medicine. What we saw there was that when we decided to test interventions or try things, without the trust of our community, without the partnership of our communities, and that we didn't succeed and didn't do very well. When we started the clinical trials at Johns Hopkins, there was some challenges in enrolling patients, and that was a surprise to some of the clinical trialists. They had expected people to immediately want to enter the clinical trial of a new therapeutic and really couldn't understand why that was not the case. And in part, it's that we hadn't done any of the work necessary during this COVID pandemic to establish trust with the community and really to understand the different parts of the people we were trying to help and what they were dealing with. Certainly in the city of Baltimore, there were people who were marginalized, perhaps people who used drugs were disproportionately affected by this epidemic. People who did not speak English, who came to the U.S. from other countries, were disproportionately impacted. We saw people who had to go to work every day and couldn't afford to take the time to be in a clinical trial, also disproportionately impacted. And really taking a step back and establishing true community engagement and understanding what people needed, the questions they wanted answered, were critically important. And Shruti mentioned long COVID, and that's a perfect example. There was no scientific agenda to address long COVID. That really arose from researchers listening to the community. People didn't get better. And fortunately, there were some early studies set up to allow us to address that. But even as we sit here today, 4 years later, we're only now applying the rigorous scientific methodologies to the clinical trials necessary to understand how to help people who are still experiencing side effects and not back to where they were before they got COVID. So I think there's certainly, that's an example, though, where the community eventually was heard by people that designed clinical trials. It took years, but those are now underway. So I think there are many lessons that we can learn, but when I look at the work that I see here in India through YRGCARE and HIV, many of those lessons that we're still learning with COVID are really taking place every day here. Engage in the community, asking what the important questions are to that population of people, to that community of people, and then designing rigorous research to answer those questions. And then taking that research and the findings and bringing that back to the same community and even beyond. And I think it's important to recognize what's done here extends not just to the people being cared for by YRG, but really around the world from those lessons. So it's really important. I think the final point I'll make is we do need to learn from this. I had the opportunity to travel to Hong Kong a couple of years, about 3 years after the SARS-1 epidemic hit. And they had built a large hospital, many floors dedicated to patients with SARS. It was shut down. They had converted that hospital to other problems and no longer built that infrastructure. So as we think about what we could have learned from SARS-1 and apply that later, we perhaps would have been in a better place. So my hope is that we continue to be more prepared. For my own part, I know what to do at Hopkins to build a field hospital in the parking lot of the Johns Hopkins Bayview parking lot. That part is simple, but the other parts are relatively more complicated and really require people to come together quickly and start to move in the same direction. So I hope we've learned these lessons, and I know Gavin is going to speak next, is helping us on preparing for the next pandemic.
Thank you. So I think I'm the last speaker, so I'll try and be as brief as I can. But it is a pleasure and an honor to be here, to honor Suniti Solomon of the Suniti Solomon Foundation and the opening of YRGCARE, I guess 2.0. But I think the excellent work that's been going on at YRGCARE for the decades. Talk about today, the task, I kind of interpreted it as telling the story, if you like, about intense. It was to work on a project that impacted the lives of hundreds of millions of people and to really be at the forefront of responding to the pandemic, because I think, as you are aware, before there's vaccines, before there's therapeutics, the only thing that you can put in a doctor's hands or in the public health community's hands is a diagnostic test, and it is the first line of defense. But again, this is not Abbott's first pandemic, so that's kind of something that we could rely on. And I don't know if you're aware that Abbott built the first HIV test to protect the world's blood pandemics in this way. But this one was a little bit different. I think we started looking at the situation in December of 2019. Got that first sequence, we were able to kind of spring into action. But in the interim, we were debating. Actually, there was a lot of debate at the senior level about, is this going to be another SARS? Is this going to be MERS? Is this going to pitter away? So we were watching what was going on, and it was very clear, at least to our group, that this was not going to be another pressure that would be on about other coronaviruses, to try and make the right decisions early, and that proved very useful. We weren't sure ones do we prioritize. We're going to try and prioritize building all of them, but it really was clear that we would need to be able to identify people who are actually infected. That was going to be the critical part. Differential diagnosis, so PCR tests, antigen tests, all of these things would be important. But we also knew that serology tests would be important to understand immunity, to see whether somebody was protected, how long this lasted, contact tracing from a public health perspective. So we actually started multiple teams, and we were fortunate in that we had alignment and support from the very top level at Abbott, and who basically gave us the all hands on deck. This is the most important thing for the corporations. Drop everything. And that aligned the whole corporation. And it is amazing what you can accomplish when everybody's pulling in the same direction, focused on one problem. That extends actually beyond Abbott. I think when the pandemic was, initiating and all through it, everybody pulled together. You could ask anybody for something, and they'd give you the shirt off their back if it was for COVID-19. There was complete alignment. So this was very a critical factor in the success and the ability to respond. Some key early questions were, do we use the CDC's test? We looked at that and made the decision not to go that route, and that we would rely on our own scientists. And I had extreme confidence in our scientists. The person who designed Abbott's first test was Kachung Luk, who's a gentleman, 72 years old, from Hong Kong, has been doing this, keeps telling me, I've been doing this since I was a little boy. And so he was immediately able to pick the right target, and it stood the test of time to this day. And getting the monoclonal antibodies for an antigen test, that actually is not easy and takes a while. Designing a PCR test in relative scale is pretty simple. Getting biologics that work for antigen testing is quite difficult. We were fortunate that a team from Korea, actually working with the team from Korea, was able to, they had a monoclonal in their freezer that was able to work, so believe it or not. So that was kind of a fantastic stroke of luck in a way. And what format to use? Point of care, core, centralized lab testing, lateral flow, all of these were key questions. So we tried to kind of address them by building them all. In serology, do we go after the spike protein or nucleocapsid? We selected nucleocapsid because it was less variable. But I think these were kind of important decisions that we had to make. And getting samples. even when early on, was incredibly difficult. How do you get positive samples for assay validation? And we relied on the network of collaborators we had through our global surveillance program and others to come to us with samples. It's also clear that we would have to figure out how to use these tests. We had a broad idea of how they would, but we didn't really know the utility. Normally with the test, just for the record, you would understand the clinical utility and then you design the test and then you go through this. Well, this was the opposite. We knew we had to design these tests with some idea of how they'd be applied, but then we had to do the research to try and understand what is the best way to deploy the tests for the most clinical benefit and public health benefit. Giving an example of negative while you're PCR positive. Understanding that you can be PCR positive for weeks, but you're no longer infectious. And we did the research showing that when you were PCR positive but antigen negative, the virus was immune complex, and that's why you were not seeing it on an antigen test, and it was no longer infectious. So in fact, an antigen test was very useful, because if you were negative, you were no longer infectious, you could go back to your life, whereas you could be PCR positive for weeks, and that could really disrupt things. Some key learnings that we did during, or had to work with partners and collaborate with people who were seeing patients. I think, thinking about the virus itself, also its diversity, how much, I think it was mentioned, how it mutates. We quickly were learning that it evolved very fast. And so we were obviously concerned as how would this impact our diagnostic tests. So we rolled COVID-19 into our global surveillance program, which has been ongoing for 30 years on HIV, looking at how that virus is changing over time, and started sequencing thousands and thousands and thousands of COVID samples from all over the world to try and understand how that virus was changing. Actually, in Illinois, I think we were one of the first who were sequencing COVID-19, and I think we were either the first or second to identify Delta. It was a fascinating time in the U.S. and I think globally. And one of our partners at Syria in South Africa actually identified the Beta variant and the Omicron variant. And we all recall getting the phone call on Thanksgiving Day that they had identified Omicron, which was, again, incredibly stressful. But we were also reassured because he had already tested it with our diagnostics and we knew that they worked. So that was kind of a kind of happy ending to that day in a way. But I think the key challenge, another key challenge, just to give you a context of the unusualness of building diagnostic tests and deploying them during this pandemic was cotton swabs. Who would have thought that cotton swabs would be the weakest link? We had developed all these amazing technologies and tests, but you couldn't get the cotton swab to put on a stick to shove up somebody's nose. And so that was a problem. Viral transport media. We were like begging, borrowing, and stealing viral transport media at some point before we figured out you could just have it dry. It was these kind of little details, like how do you develop and manufacture and distribute something when the world is on lockdown, when you can't get what you normally would take for granted. It was incredibly challenging, and I tip my hat to our logistics teams who kind of overcame these hurdles that happened one after another. Every day there was another one. The logistics of getting stuff in, also the logistics of getting stuff out, getting tests out of the building, getting tests out of the country into other countries was incredibly challenging. So you don't really think about these things, but these are the little details that can derail big programs that need to be considered and that I will consider. Even from the development of the test, Sunil mentioned building the first test. Well, my friend KC, who built that test, who's been doing it since he was a little boy, but he's very fond of a particular enzyme. So he designed the test, and we run it to the factory, and the guy in the factory says, we don't use that enzyme. And so we're like, nuts. So we had to run back and reformulate what an enzyme does you. But that was a huge learning for us moving forward. Now every test we build for emerging and re-emerging pathogens is designed in such a way that I can walk into the factory and we can scale it if we need to. Because these are the little things that, these are the little things that will trip you up. And that brings me to kind of the closing point of looking to the next pandemic. And so we've launched the Abbott Pandemic Defense Coalition, which is the first of its kind industry-led network of like-minded experts who are trying to identify emerging threats, emerging pathogens that could be a pandemic threat. And we're very proud that YRG was one of our first partners, and still to this day an instrumental partner in this program. And this program is on 22 sites on 5 continents. But I think Sunil, I will credit, he's got some brilliant insights. He also coined the term, at least for us, that I've been repeating, so you didn't have copyright on it, but is that we're trying to prevent the next pandemic while ending these existing ones. So we're surrounded by existing pandemics that we still have not ended, and we can't forget those, but we can do two at the same time. I like the efficiency. You can try and identify emerging threats, prevent the next pandemic, while helping to tackle the existing ones today. So people who are already impacted by existing pandemics. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gavin. So I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. I don't know if people have raise your hand, you can pass around. But while we're waiting, maybe I can start with the questions for Paul. I think one of the challenges which I've heard remarked is the pharmacy is your first doctor. Before they show up in the hospital, they've probably been through like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, ritonavir. So how do we deal with
That's important in the United States, but maybe I'll take an analogy in my own outpatient clinical practice. There might be a new vaccine, for example. And, people are generally very wary of vaccines nowadays, at least in the United States. But what I found most important is that we would have education sessions. What we found was if the patient comes in and asks our advice, they may or may not take that to heart. But then they would go and ask the person at the front desk who's checking them in, what do you think of it? And you don't have everyone in your organization maybe have to agree with you, but at least about something that's new, something that's different. I think that's very important. And I think people are desperate. I mean, they're really looking to do something. I mean, and there's potential harm, as we learned with hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. So, I think when people want to do something, it's very hard to get them to do something else, but people like to feel like they're in control in these situations. And that's why sometimes, we argue and say, well, let's at least have some supportive care. Most of the things that we have, there's no evidence that taking guaifenesin for your cough or cold works really, or dextromethorphan or so on. But at least we don't think they do harm. And I think when you have pharmacists, my hopes are that I think that's such an important piece of this nowadays, certainly in the U.S. and in many countries, that I think pharmacists have to be as engaged and stakeholders in trying to help solve and provide something that's credible without doing harm to people.
Thanks, Bob. Are there any questions from the audience? There is food at the end of this. And if you ask a question, you probably get food first. Oh, we have a question there.
How do we prepare ourselves in India for the next pandemic?
I mean, I think India is what we have to do everywhere. Right? First, is that I think it's tempting right now to break down. Mark mentioned the situation with SARS-1, versus SARS-2, the fact that the hospital, shutting down systems that were set up for COVID, is a mistake, and thinking about how we can learn from those things and set up surveillance systems and early identification. So that's the first thing, is to just not forget. I think it's tempting to want to put that behind us, and we shouldn't do that. I think I talked about how some of the things that we're doing in the U.S. and that's happening is trying to have routine surveillance for symptoms and things like that that are unusual. I think that there's, the early identification is critical, I think, with COVID, and oftentimes we feel like we're chasing, we're behind. Things have already emerged, things have already spread. So I think implementing methods to be following, to be surveilling for symptoms and changes in symptomatology, even for respiratory infections, right? Just kind of looking at whether there are changes in those year to year. It's a complicated question because I think it's multiple facets. I think we talked about a lot of different things here, but that's just an additional thing that I would add. I don't know, I'll leave it to Gavin.
It is a complicated question, but I think the first thing, echo everything Shruti said, but it's to be looking, to be vigilant, not to go to sleep. And that's what we're trying to do with YRGCARE. I think there are many different ways that you can go about it, and we're trying to experiment with some of those, whether it's working with physicians because they're the people who are going to be seeing patients with illnesses that they can't explain. Don't ignore that. Also, networks that are looking for one specific thing, like influenza, and you've got somebody who's severely ill, but it's not influenza, and then they throw the samples away. That's crazy. The negative samples in these types of scenarios are golden. That's what you should be looking for. Or innovating around electronic medical records that we've been trying to. It's more challenging than you would think, but there's a lot of data that's being captured on a routine basis with this new era of AI and data analytics. How do we screen the data that's already there to find the cases that might be worth a closer look? And one of the things that we found in our study doing this at Rush is having the staff who are trained to engage with the patients and enroll them such that they're willing to participate and remove the barriers to that participation.
So thank you very much. So my question is getting the right information. Okay, it was quite challenging during COVID. We were lucky, at least YRG, because of the grand rounds that were conducted at JHU and did impact our clinical practice quite a bit. To give an example, hospitals in India wouldn't see patients without having a CT done. Okay, so if they were to be seen by any doctor going in for COVID, they have to get a CT done. So I had a tough time convincing my patients, you don't need a CT, don't worry about it, we can manage it. And it's not routinely recommended. So the biggest challenges was, where do you get this information during such times, because there's so much information floating out there, and what is your advice?
I'll let others speak to the clinical information, but I do think that one of the things that I mentioned is just sharing and collaboration. One of the things that happened at Hopkins that I thought was really fantastic was there was this group of, because I think, as Gavin mentioned, I think for all of us, it was so challenging to keep up with the literature. And the literature was not just peer-reviewed papers, but it was coming out. It was happening in some places, but I think we can probably do a better job of disseminating that information broadly. I don't know if others want to speak to the clinical.
Well, I think it's actually a challenging point you raised, and I'm not sure we have the answer to it because there are so many ways to disseminate information. So right now, it's very routine for scientific papers to be in pre-peer review format, and in general, that's good. And during COVID, during this early time where we were searching for anything we could do, people were sharing through Twitter, now I suppose X, and other formats. Some of that was great. Some of the information people needed, but many of those messages were actually negative messages, sending the wrong message, or disseminating things that actually increased distrust of medicine across the system. So the confusion is really hard to control. I think what you saw emerge, we were fortunate at Johns Hopkins, where that information from clinical trials and clinical papers got funneled through a group of experts, and what came out was a consensus of trust this, don't trust that. That slowly came, at least from other bodies, where they helped us sort through that data. But it wasn't there early on. So I think one of the questions is, what is the channel, and where can we get those voices speaking more loudly and more clearly early on. And of course, there were many voices that were quite loud that drowned out some of that information. But we do, I think, have the foundation now to stand up those bodies of experts that can help sort through the information and deliver it through trusted channels. And we also need to agree on what a trusted channel is, and that's, I think, challenging.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it was very interesting, all your, your insights and then your experiences. I just want to ask about vaccine hesitancy. Mark was talking about, getting community engagement or getting the trust. And would you think that vaccine hesitancy, the kind of information that is coming now, would that be a big challenge in the future pandemics?
I think you raise a really important issue, and I think vaccine hesitancy is one of the ways in which we may be less well prepared today. But really, I think part of the challenge is how we gain trust. And it's true of getting people to participate in clinical trials. The example Sunil mentioned earlier about all the things people tried oftentimes is on the advice of someone they talk to, not based on scientific data from clinical trials. So it does get to this fundamental issue of trust, and I'm not entirely sure how we get that back without really working every day in multiple different communities to understand where their hesitancy is coming from, their distrust of whatever the message may be, and trying to get at the heart of that. And I think that's really hard work and not something we're particularly effective at. And I think the last comment I'll make is that we also need to get the messaging right. I think many people, at least in where I practice in the United States, thought the vaccine would prevent infection. And when that very quickly didn't appear to be the case, that eroded trust rapidly. So we need to make sure we get the messaging right when we have results of a clinical trials for those vaccines, and not overstate the findings and really get the messaging right before we disseminate it. Because part of that comes from messaging that came from many authoritative bodies.
Any other questions?
Okay, I think it's the first time we've ever had a scientific discussion involving both of us, first of all, in all these years. Anyway, okay, so this is a double header. So one is I'm involved in, I'm a surgeon, so I do a lot of laparoscopy and all that, and I'm currently involved in 4 different projects which involve artificial intelligence in what I do. And I'm amazed. I mean, I'm purely doing the clinical aspect of it, as in I supply the case data and the CTs and everything. But what I see from the discussions from the group that I'm in is how fast they are able to identify patterns and how fast we're able to translate them into real-time data as well as we keep progressing. I do a lot of hernia surgery, and the way it is, the computers are able to identify old surgeries and old meshes placed and everything. It's so fast. And I want to know, like, from the entire panel, in the future, is AI going to be, I do recall you mentioning a little bit about it, but is it going to play a major role in identifying the patterns that can maybe make us, give us a good prediction of how bad things can be and how fast things can progress? So that's one, that's the first question. The second part is, I'm a big-time social media person as well. I love being on social media, watching nonsense on it, and sending the same nonsense to other people as well. But what I saw during the COVID time especially was from your aspects as leaders, as forerunners, from your own institutes dealing with clinical aspects of COVID, how tough was it for you all to handle governmental interference when you all needed to get your data out to say this is what we need to be doing? Because I recall, as a surgeon, I was one of those few surgeons who dared to do surgery during COVID, of course taking all the precautions, but those precautions kept changing. Every 2 weeks or something, I would be changing the way I was dressing up for surgery. And another thing that we found was what we call in your country as fake news, here we call it as WhatsApp University. Okay, right? Is the amount of things that go wrong with what the message is spread around is. How do you all deal with that? Because you are premier institutions from the world itself, and how would you deal with those kind of situations?
I don't know, that's a lot to unpack. I think from an AI perspective, I don't have a crystal ball, or else I'd be doing much better in the stock market. But I do think that AI is going to have an impact on this. Exactly how, I think, will evolve over time. I think getting to the social media element of things, that's a global problem that's going to require a global solution. I'll tell you an anecdote related to COVID, that I had a paper rejected. Oh, I know you're all devastated. But the reviewer cited Twitter. That was the first time. It wasn't like citing something from a peer-reviewed paper or something else, but cited Twitter. So I think that is a huge problem. I think from a government perspective and data coming out, I myself don't have really experience with that, so I'm going to pass that over.
I think I'll just make a few comments. Many of my patients, I think, they want to be in control. And I think just like taking alternative medications or seeking information on the internet, it gives them control. And I think we have to become more facile as people that have expertise at trying to somehow enter that same space in a credible way, because I think the pandemic, certainly countries where there is clear communications, and I think public relations agencies have pointed to New Zealand as always having a very consistent message that wasn't fractious there and so on, that led, even though some people would argue that they overstayed their lockdown, people were very happy and they trusted the government and the scientific authorities. So I think the communication strategies do have to really start at the top and downward, and also recognize that people wish to seek information on their own. They want to feel like they're the expert nowadays, and I think we have to find out ways that they can discover sort of credible information, and honestly, they're going to have to start weighing things themselves. And I think we have to posit such that we should say, well, we already know there's this information. I think lawyers know to go in court and put out the bad stuff first, and sort of, get it out of the way. And I think we probably didn't do that. I think we changed recommendations because that's how the science changed. We're used to that. But I think that message never came out ahead of itself.
Do I answer this?
Yeah, I think like the others, I don't necessarily, those are big, tough questions that I don't think we necessarily have the answers to. The social media, I think there is damage too that was done in this pandemic, I think, to both individuals who were very active on social media, as well as to trust in science and epidemiology. I know that people started becoming, it was a way to put information out, but then people started to have fear about putting that information out for the way that it was received. I think that we have to learn from it, and it's here to stay. It is going to be one of the vehicles that people use. I think in the U.S. it wasn't government restriction. In fact, it was quite the reverse. Even at a university, if you weren't happy about one of your faculty members perhaps saying something on social media, there was no way to regulate that. We don't regulate that. So anything was fair game. So I think that's just, it's here to stay. We have to figure out the best practices for working with it. In terms of AI, I don't have a crystal ball either, but I think it is part of the future of how we do this, and I think there are large investments happening both in universities and companies and other places. I think the key is for us to learn how to work with it, to understand the information that we're getting, and so there is going to still need to be human interaction with that AI.
Well, I'm not sure I have much to add to either of those topics. I think you asked two of the more vexing things that we face as human beings, AI and social media. And of course, the two will intersect and are already intersecting in many ways with false messaging coming out. But I do think it will be helpful. I'll stick with AI because I cannot solve the social media issue, but AI will help recognize patterns of emerging infections. And you wonder, you read reports about how some of this started to emerge earlier in 2019, and could we have picked that up earlier if that data were going through an algorithm that to look for a pandemic, something that folks like Gavin would work with and other systems up around the world in ways that human beings may take longer to recognize, and taking until January of 2020, for example. And that 3-month head advantage, if that's what it took, would have been great. So I think that's a place. I think in terms of already seeing this in design of therapeutics, AI is already advancing the design of drugs for multiple human conditions. And you wonder if you could take that viral sequence that was first posted and really get some head starts very quickly through AI, like within minutes of it being posted, for companies to begin to work on therapeutics. So I think those are 2 areas AI will affect, both pattern recognition of emergence and then therapeutics more quickly.
The only thing I'll add to that is we need to learn as clinicians and scientists how to communicate on social media. I think that's like a major weakness, because the problem is like social media, like Google or Facebook, they should regulate it, but it depends on who owns it. If the owner changes, regulations change. The one thing we did, if you want to look at, is you can look up COVID Gyan, and you'll actually find Paul speaking in like Telugu, Hindi, Tamil, and English. We actually made videos right in the beginning, and that had like millions of views all across India. I don't think Paul has seen himself speak Telugu. But there are videos of Paul speaking Telugu explaining hydroxychloroquine does not work. So we did some initially, but then you get caught up in life. So we almost need someone who's going to control the social media for us and teach us how to communicate to the lay public. Because that's a gap and something we should address.
I have a question. See, as a clinician, I have seen a lot of chronic, I'm a clinician, so I've seen a lot of chronic cough, like prolonged cough, which is very obviously seen these days post-COVID. Is it true, really? Because these days people have chronic cough for months, and everybody relates to like BC, before Christ and after Christ. Every disease now is before COVID and after COVID. And as a gynecologist, most of my patients are saying their infertility issues because of COVID. Anything like...
I think I certainly agree with you. I feel the incidence of chronic cough has increased in my patients. On the other hand, though, people love to anchor to something. Right, so COVID affected us all, and it's an easy thing to anchor to. It may be correct, but I think this is just a natural tendency. I mean, our brains abhor uncertainty. They don't like a vacuum. They're going to anchor in something. If you get ill tomorrow, are you going to blame the food that you had just 12 hours ago, but it was likely the food in your refrigerator from 2 or 3 days ago, right? Because you went to something out of your normal pattern. So I think that's obviously an issue here. But certainly people have suffered some chronic lung disease after COVID. And how much of that's attributable to that cough, I'm uncertain.
Thank you.
So I think in interest of time, we'll wind up. But I must thank everyone here. Just one last question for the panel. Just one quick answer. We'll go down. What do you think is the next pandemic?
Well, I'll start. It seems every decade we've had a coronavirus. So I think coronavirus, I mean, certainly avian influenza right now is giving some people concerns, mainly because it's quite promiscuous among mammals, except for humans at the moment. So obviously those are the 2 major ones, but who knows?
Well, I think the faster spreading ones are definitely going to be a respiratory one, and I would say another coronavirus is a good likelihood. We are tracking some kind of more interesting tick-borne and mosquito-borne viruses that we're seeing, so but they're not going to spread as fast as a respiratory virus would be. So
Zika spread pretty quickly, so mosquitoes can. Ticks are slow.
I'm not going to disagree. I'm going to have the same.
Well, I'm going to flip the question around and say I'm actually more concerned about what the pandemic of COVID has done to other pandemics like HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, TB, malaria, all these major killers around the globe that took a major step back. And even as we sit here today, we're still not where we would have been without that. So we have a lot of pandemics already dealing with without the pace of a respiratory one, although I would not bet against coronaviruses as the next one.
Thank you all. Can we get a round of applause for our panel? And I encourage you to go up to them over the break, and if you have any questions, they definitely have the answer to your questions. Thank you very much.
Standing. Okay. Yes, that's right. Can you come closer, like? Okay.
Move your pictures.
It's too much of a contrast from then and now. Pictures like 3 years old. Smiles all of you? Please join hands there.
We thank each of you for your participation today, and request each of you to join us at dinner that will be served in the adjoining hall outside. I would also request the panelists and Dr. Amita Gupta and Dr. Greg Lucas to just stay behind for a brief interaction with the press. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.